whole.
Oh, that would be a great mentor.
So yeah, so that was it. So of course, when when it got down to budget issues.
Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
Or whatever.
How fun.
Jane, you haven't bought a house here yet?
House here? No, not yet. No, I'm actually not. I've done my house buying for the year. I'm gonna have one place. One place. You know the lady that asked a question about
Morgan, is this being screened as we?
Yeah. I know her. She's on the line.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, we should be paying for an outside place, and we don't are taking kids to outdoor spaces. I mean, the one I'm just amazed by this one community and it wasn't. They didn't bring in fancy natural playground landscape. They brought them outside. They brought them outside, and they put together traditional wooden huts and did a little. But so it wasn't expensive. Right. And Brickports has got a fabulous so it's really good because it's a play space for kids, natural environment, very challenging, and people can go see it and get ideas. But yeah, I mean, part of it is in Ontario. What would be allowed? So that's when it's in license comes up with license. We've got programs where the 5-year-olds can plan.
Take your seat, Mark. You're late. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and friends of early childhood learning and education in this province. My name is John Abbott, and I've been asked or corralled to sort of MC and facilitate this workshop here today, and I certainly appreciate that opportunity. We have some interesting points to cover today. We have some very well versed and knowledgeable people in this area to address us as well. And but more importantly, we have designed the day for we hope maximum participation by everyone here in this room, because it's with your insights that we feel that we can actually move forward with what we are calling really an agenda on early childhood learning in this province. And Kathy LeGrow will speak on that in a second as to really what we're trying to achieve here. Just a few sort of housekeeping measures, or very few. if I could ask you if you can silence your cell phones and the like, that would be appreciated. There's tea and coffee and water here before the break, and there are, if you consume too much, there are rooms outside that you can evacuate as you wish. So I'm going to just sort of very quickly thank a few people and acknowledge a few people up front. Certainly we wouldn't be here today without the Jimmy Pratt Foundation, of which I am a member, but we have Kathy Pratt LeGrow, who is the chair and really mover and shaker behind that foundation, as many other things in this city and province. So Kathy will speak to us shortly. She has a couple other members of her family who are also on the foundation with us. Chris and Robin LeGrow are here, Tommy Cleal and Jamie Podester. We are represented as well by the fact that, and Dave Philpott as well, David, but I was going to talk about you in a second in another fashion, so my apologies. We also are here because of the Margaret McCain through the Wallace and Margaret Family Foundation. They've been great supporters with our foundation, and we've partnered as well with the Harris Center, and we have Mike Clear and Morgan Murray here as well today. We have Dave Philpott, who will be speaking with us, but Dave is on our foundation, but is really the brain trust behind us. We know what we want to achieve, but Dave tells us what is achievable, at least as far as the research and literature tells us. And we certainly appreciate his guidance in everything we're doing. And we have Marie Ryan here as well, and Marie has been very helpful with us in developing the discussion paper, which you have before you. And there was a working group sort of pulled together. I was just going to ask people who were involved in the focus group around the discussion paper, if you could just raise your hands so we have an idea. So just to show you that there was some input. And I recognize many faces and know certainly many people who were here almost a year and a half ago in the same room where we did a discussion forum on the Early Years Study 3 report and its implications for the province. Who in this room today were here a year and a half ago as well? Good. So there's a lot of consistency and hopefully knowledge that we can transfer from what we've learned up till now, what we want to learn here today, and others will speak about what our plans are for over the next year. So there is an agenda in front of you. I believe everybody has a package. If there are any questions on that, please let me or Kathy or others know about that. We are going to run this pretty tight. We are being streamed live, compliments of the Harris Center and Memorial University, so we certainly appreciate that. And as a result, we feel that we should try to keep on time, and it is, and we'll ask people sort of to keep the shuffling the chairs to a minimum, just not to distract our other audiences. So I'm going to call now on Kathy Pratt LeGrow, who really does not need much of an introduction other than she's a fantastic person to work with, a great taskmaster, and as education is definitely her passion. So Kathy.
Always my challenge when I follow a much taller person, considering there's just about a foot difference in our heights. Thank you. Good morning and welcome, friends and colleagues. It's so wonderful to have you here. As John said, sometimes I don't see myself as a hard taskmaster, but as you can see, many of the people who are working with us today are actually part of the foundation, and they work for free. And that's why they're asked to do what they do. They don't realize what they're being volunteered for. But anyway, and I really appreciate that. Because of them, all of this is happening now and into the future, and what's happened in the past. Because many of you were here before, either as part of our discussion on the Early Years 3 study with the McCain Foundation. We have Jane with us, and you'll meet her later. She's a very important part of that foundation. We had Margie with us last night, Margaret McCain, who gave a wonderful talk, and I know some of you were there at the university about successful children and successful social policy. And this is the third event because we had a press conference yesterday to release this report. We just want you to know and pay attention. This is a discussion paper. It's a dynamic paper to start a dialogue, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We met with Premier Dunderdale yesterday. I'm off topic altogether, so David is starting to get worried now. But we met with Premier Dunderdale yesterday after we released this paper and presented her with the paper. And I think she and her Minister of Child, Youth and Family Services, along with her Minister of Education, were a little bit worried that we were giving them as a fait accompli, giving them this paper. That's not the case, and I want to make that very clear with you folks today. This is the beginning of a dialogue. This is a beginning of building a roadmap to show the province, the public, the government, anybody who cares to listen, that this is what good early learning and care should look like. And we want everybody to participate in that dialogue. We want this to be a ground-up discussion paper. And as this unfolds during the day, you will see that there will be opportunities along the way where we will get good information from well-informed, passionate people about this issue that will address some of the concerns that the public would have, such as the economics of it, such as the educational appropriateness of it. So, you know, does it work over the long term? All that sort of thing. And you'll be invited to all of that as we proceed. So welcome to this event, and thank you for your participation and for being here. Now I have to go back and find out where I am in my notes, which I apologize for that. We're very pleased as a foundation to be part of this. We're very, along with partnering with the Harris Center and having their technology here today has been very useful and into the future. We're hoping we're going to be able to access that technology to be able to make this a provincial dialogue so we can take it out to rural Newfoundland if that opportunity presents. We're prepared to go to rural Newfoundland and to these communities where, when you think about child care, daycare, and early childhood education in communities where there's only seasonal employment, obviously those things look different in rural Newfoundland. So it's not a one solution for everybody. It's a variety of solutions throughout the province. We couldn't do this without the McCain Foundation. They were the ones who brought us here in the first place. I had all this passion about young children and young children being ready for school, and Margaret McCain was the one who said, I think this is the way for us to go forward. So in partnership with them, along with 6 other foundations, we are working across Canada to develop good early learning and care throughout our country. Newfoundland doesn't look good on the national map. We're not performing well. I don't think it's anybody's fault in particular. I think this is a very complex province, and most of you work within institutions, government departments, and you know how difficult it is to deliver services in this province. That's why this paper, this discussion paper, this roadmap that we're preparing for our province has to reflect the realities and the diversities of our province, and we need you to help us with that. So families, as you know, need more options. We're in a changing working environment. We need skilled workers. We need people to come back to Newfoundland, young families who expect to have good early learning and care, who expect to have full-day kindergarten. Why would they come back to Newfoundland if they can get full-day kindergarten for their families somewhere else? So these are the choices that some families are having to make, and we know that they are making them based on what is best for their families. And we want our children to have the best possible start in life. Even if someone is a stay-at-home mom, she needs good resources at her disposal. She needs playgroups for her children. She needs to be supported in how to teach her children to deal with conflicts, to engage with others, to problem solve, all of those good things that good early learning and care imparts to our children. So enjoy the day. I'll be back at the end of the day. And please feel free to approach any of us if you have any questions or concerns. And welcome along for the ride. Thank you.
So, Kathy, how did the meeting go with the Premier? So we're going to get you to speak on that later. So they let you in the room. That's a good sign. That's a very good sign. All right. We're going to call on Jane Bertrand here now in a second. But on your tables, we circulated a series of 3 questions that we're going to discuss later on today. So we thought we'd put them out early, so you had an opportunity to think about those. You might want to take a few quick notes on what you hear today to help you in your discussions later on. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. Certainly my privilege and honor now to invite Jane to speak and address us. Jane is definitely a Canadian expert in this whole area. She's done a lot of work, has helped certainly inform our work and our discussion so far here in Newfoundland, and has been a super resource to our group. Her bio is attached, so I'm not going to go into that. Some of you already know Jane. She's asked her earlier if she's bought a house here in Newfoundland, given the amount of time, and the prices are still going up, Jane. So, you know, dare I say, buy now and don't regret later. So, Jane, I'll bring you forward, and we're going to hopefully have a few minutes for a few questions of Jane as well. So, Jane.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John. It's great to be here. Thank you, Pratt Foundation and Harris Center. Our foundation is delighted to be working with you, and look forward to a long and ongoing collaboration together. Before I get started, I know some of you, but I certainly don't know everybody, and I'd just like to get a sense of generally who's here. So how many of you are with public health? Okay. Or child, okay. How many of you are with family resource types of programs, family resource centers or related, parenting? Okay. How many of you are with childcare or nursery schools or preschools, early childhood educators? Okay, great. How many of you are with education, the formal education system or post-secondary education? Okay. So we've got, I know we have university and we have college, and do we have anybody from K to 12? Okay. How many of you are with other types of nonprofit organizations, NGOs, child welfare, the municipality? Anybody here municipality? Great. Okay. Anybody missed besides my colleagues at the table? Foundation? No. Well, that's great. It's good to have that kind of, I mean, that's part of what I think we're trying to have happen is a dialogue that goes across our different disciplines, our different professional cultures, and tries to make sense on how things might move forward. What I'm going to talk today is about trends looking forward, things that merge. I'm not going to go province through every province and the 3 territories and give blow-by-blow description of what initiatives have happened this year and what's coming up on the horizon. That would take all day and be very, very boring. I do have a reference for you at the end where you can go and find that kind of information. But what I've tried to do is lift up the general trends from Canada with a few references to what's happening internationally that might be relevant. There is nothing in that I'm going to say that is going to present the model for Newfoundland and Labrador. That would not be possible for me to do. That's what you have to do. And the other reality is that every jurisdiction, every province and territory in Canada has a different starting point based on what's already there. And we have to work with what we already have in place to think about how we might go forward. So for instance, in Ontario, junior kindergarten is for 4-year-olds has been universally available for a long time, and the take-up rate is about 90%. Before 90% of 4-year-olds take part in a junior kindergarten program. Over the last, it was introduced in the late 60s and grew to be widespread province-wide through the 90s, and it's been highly taken up. You could not design the next steps without taking that into account and the professionals who were working in it. So it was a reality for that province that is not a reality for other provinces. So Ontario does not provide the perfect model for you. When BC looks at what it's got its Strong Start programs, which are family resource centers operated directly by the school board the school boards in 50% of their schools staffed by early childhood educators. It's well entrenched. Those educators are part of local labor groups, et cetera, et cetera. You couldn't go forward in BC without taking that particular component in hand. So, and everybody has different demographic and geographical realities, and Kathy mentioned that here. So what I'm going to talk about are some trends that are happening and some commonalities that are cutting across jurisdictions, but there's nothing here that's the model for Newfoundland. Okay, so first of all, I want to give a definition of early childhood education, and I do understand that there's different language, and those of you who may not be immersed in the sector may find this, sometimes talk about early learning and childcare, and early childhood education, and to some extent they can be interchangeable terms, and other times they have specific meanings, and in Newfoundland and Labrador I think there are some differences, and they're laid out in the discussion paper. Okay, about what the early learning is here, and across here the childcare, early childhood education is here. I'm talking about early childhood education. That was the common umbrella term we used for early years study, and we defined it as any time children are together where there's an intentional pedagogy and qualified educators. So it's not just licensed childcare, early learning and childcare that's licensed. It included everything that where children might be coming together, where there was some intentionality, purposeful play, and there were qualified educators back in early childhood education. So that includes many of the parenting family literacy programs, the Strong Start in BC, because they have an intentional early learning framework curriculum that they use, and they have ECEs. It includes includes pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, and those sorts of programs are directly operated by the schools. So it was a broad, for the purposes of the early years study, it was a broad definition that was defined that way. Early childhood education is a powerful engine of opportunity and addresses equity issues. In fact, the OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, which did Strong Start 1, Strong Start 2, and Strong Start 3 that many of you are familiar with, they did a survey for Strong Start 3, which is a toolbox, and I'll come back to that later. And they found that among the member countries, and we are a member country, that equity was the #1 goal for early childhood education. People, the government officials and others in the sector who responded to the survey identified equity as the #1 goal, equity amongst children. They did not define labor force participation for parents as the #1 goal. They did not define readiness for school as the #1 goal, but this notion of equality of opportunity, some equity amongst all families and children, which is kind of interesting. Early childhood education can be an essential anchor to pull together that whole panoply we have of programs and services, including family supports, family resource, childcare, early intervention, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, prenatal, postnatal, etc. Integration has to happen at multiple levels, and definitely that was a trend that is popping up across our countries and internationally, of trying to build a more integrated platform so that families have something that they can find and understand in their communities, and that is actually a smarter way to spend money. That is an overriding theme we're seeing across this country, and we're certainly seeing it in other jurisdictions. Not that it's an easy one. So many of you have seen this before, and those of you who were there last night saw a version of it, but we'll see it again. This is what exists now pretty much everywhere. Even where there's been some efforts to pull things together, we still have something that looks like this. We have a state or provincial, territorial level of government with multiple departments or ministries who are involved, who then we have local or regional authorities that are closer to the ground, and then in the community we have something that looks like this. And this works amazing number of countries. Go, oh yes, that's us. Australia, that's us. England, that's us. States, absolutely. And what we have then, this is a family, who has a child, a young child, that's what's out in their community. A mass of different things are happening, okay? And if you need this, if you need speech and language, or you want some support on breastfeeding, you go here. If you want childcare, you go there. If you want play group, you go there. And often, in some of our most disadvantaged communities, we have a lot of services and programs and a lot of investment. But it's not being terribly effective. It's not, people can't find it. Those who need it the most don't always get there. Those in the know how to access it and use the resources. We're not really, this is not a smart way to spend money. Okay? This is not an efficient, this is not meeting the needs of many families. And what one of the goals of what we're talking about, we talked about in earlier study 3, and many communities and places around the world are talking about, is how do we make something that's more of an integrated platform that's still very responsive to children and families in a local region. Nobody is calling for, I don't think, something that's a cookie cutter and it always is done this way, and so forth and so on. But how can we have something with some design around it, that design programs that make some sense out of that? No, I've moved on to the next one, I see. Make some sense out of that for families, and it can be done in a financially possible way that's sustainable. And this is kind of a design of what many people are calling for, and it doesn't all show up real well with the lights, but the idea is having early childhood, an integrated delivery platform that can provide a range of things. Doesn't mean everything would have to happen in the same location, but co-location may be part of it. But there's one place, when you know what you get at a school, you know what you get at a health center, what do you get at an early childhood center? Or how could you come in one door and find what you need without having to re-register at another door? And that's really the goal. And that will require some integration at the neighborhood and school level, integration around local decision making, and then public policy and infrastructure. For those of you who were there last night, there was a question towards the end of, to Margaret about, this is all fine and good, but do you have any idea how complicated it is? You've got different cultures, different policies, different regulations. Social services is very different than education, than health. Absolutely true. It's not an easy thing to do, and all of those, you have to deal with it at each level, and that's what a number of jurisdictions are finding. You can't just plunk early childhood services into education as a unit and walk away. Saskatchewan's done that, and now they're trying hard to integrate across and not just have a taking of a unit and moving here and it operates in exactly the same way. You've got to think about how you mesh all of those policies and regulations. We have, and taking into account different starting points. Where are the easy wins? And then how can you build from that? What resources are already there? What we do know from international research is that's a whole lot more efficient. We can take the same money and do better with it. That is not to say you don't need more money to serve all of the people all of the time. Absolutely not. But it does mean we could get a platform in place that could make better use of existing and new money, rather than continuing to fund things independently and regulate things independently and have different infrastructure set up. And I am going to get to the role that schools may have to play in this and talk a little bit more about that. So I'm going to talk about specifically about trends around governance, funding, access, learning environment, and accountability, particularly in Canada, but again with some references elsewhere. And then I'm going to take you to the ECE report that was done in 2011, which is really a measure of how system development is going towards the vision that was back here, okay, towards that in each of the provinces. And many of you have seen that before, but just to anchor it back there. So first of all, governance. What we have now is the oversight for all of those services and programs and for early childhood education, either in split or single departments and ministries. Okay? In BC, we have, for example, there are 3 ministries, and they're called 3 ministries involved. There's the Child and Family Services that is responsible for funding and so on for childcare. Licensing is done through health for regulated childcare, and early learning is the responsibility of the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education is responsible for those Strong Start programs that are, 300 out of 600 schools have those programs. So it's a fairly significant program there. They have a well-developed, beautiful early learning framework that was done by the Ministry of Education, and it's used by the Strong Start centers. Childcare, though, childcare and preschool, of which there is a lot, does not use, for the most part, that early learning framework because it's over in the Ministry of Education. It's a 0 to 6 framework, but it's in the Ministry of Education, and it doesn't apply to childcare and preschool. Now, some people are taking it up and some colleges are using it, but you see what happens when things are split. The province doesn't provide, they provide training and support and some really neat kinds of tools for the Strong Start centers, but they're not offered to the childcare and preschool. Okay? Split jurisdiction. So just as an example of where they're at. Other, and I mentioned already Saskatchewan, which took childcare and plunked it into the education department. And in that department, they operate as a separate unit. They're starting to figure out how to mesh with the rest of the education department and not be so separate and isolated, because essentially nothing has changed on the ground. And their extensive pre-kindergarten program for 3- and 4-year-olds offered by the school has had a separate curriculum, separate staffing, and even though dealing with the same ages of kids, there hasn't been much collaboration, sharing of resources, training, and so forth and so on. So this, whereas in New Brunswick has made some massive changes and addressed some of the issues that were talked about yesterday. At the forum about the question of how do you deal with the existing structures. They have actually moved to create a very integrated infrastructure to support early childhood services and early intervention, 0 to 8, overlap with the school system. They're actually tackling that question about children with special needs who are in one age group and then they hit the school system and they have to go and be reassessed, and then before they pick up on their speech and language and that sort of thing. They're actually bridging and bringing the early intervention into the school and having it work with the school special ed department. So actually it's seamless for the kids. Okay, and they're setting up an infrastructure to support this happening, to bridge the worlds of community-based program delivery, that's the childcare sector, with the publicly delivered school. And they're putting people in place who are at senior management levels who work with the school, work with the community, and work with the provincial department. And it's very comprehensive. It includes speech and language, family resource programs, etc. It's not just childcare and leave everything else behind, and so forth. And there's other examples. I'm not going to go through every jurisdiction, but you see very different ways about going about things. When there is a single department ministry, it becomes really possible to have a policy framework that focuses on child well-being, development, and learning versus labor force childcare being driven by labor force participation goals, and the early learning in the school that's reaching down from the school system being driven by other goals. That doesn't mean you don't design things so that it accommodates labor force participation, but you can start with the child and think about the child goals first, particularly when it comes together. And yes, you have to mesh program standards and regulations. In Ontario, when they moved into full-day kindergarten and trying to do an extended day for 4- and 5-year-olds that was seamless and school boards could directly operate the whole day, they had to amend the Education Act. They had to amend the Education Act to accommodate staff who are early childhood educators. They have to revise the Day Nurseries Act, and it has to talk to the Education Act. And they have people out in the field who are responsible for kindergarten and childcare. Okay, they're consultants. Now it's very, very messy, but it's a start at setting that infrastructure in place to move towards a more single jurisdiction. and taking into account that within department organization. And then looking at the local, it's no point of having everything integrated out here if you still have silos down to municipalities, school boards, public health units, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to figure that piece out too. So it's multi-leveled, and it's going to take a long time, no doubt about it. However, we do know from international research there is no jurisdiction that exists in the world that has been able to provide early childhood education to the vast majority of its preschool children who hasn't figured out some way of integrating their governance. Now, some of them have done it 0 to 3 and then 3 to 6, and usually they have a fairly universal 3 to 6, and 0 to 3 remains a bit patchy. But if you really want to accommodate and reach the majority of kids, it hasn't been done anywhere without coming together into a single ministry or department or authority. Coordination of ministries who are still maintain primary responsibility for various pieces has been a well tried out strategy, and it really hasn't worked anywhere that I'm aware of or the international researchers from the OECD are aware of. It hasn't moved the markers to, it may improve things for a while, it may do this, but as long as there are separate mandates, separate funding, separate reporting up, it's very difficult to coordinate on the ground, and interministerial committees haven't been terribly successful at making major changes. They've eaten around the edges of this issue, but they haven't actually managed to find a way to build a system that's available to most of the children most of the time. Funding. One of the surprises of earlier study 3 was that every jurisdiction had increased its funding, except for BC, to some extent to early childhood education since the pullback of the federal government in 2006. You know, we were all going to get we had big plans. Every province had big plans, and we would have been really a long way if that money, if that had followed through. But the federal government changed, the money was pulled back, $100 baby bonus a month was instead, and the provinces were left with plans, but no money. So when we went out to do an environmental scan to see what was happening in the provinces, my colleague Carrie McQuaig and I were doing the work. We thought we'd find a, flat line of spending, not much happening. Lo and behold, we found that every jurisdiction had moved forward, and many were spending a lot more money than they had been between 2005 and 2011. So Fraser Mustard was, of course, one of the authors of the earlier study, was still with us then, and he said, this isn't good enough. You have to go forward and find a way to show an index of where each jurisdiction is at. If this is really happening, show me. Show me where we're at. Find a way to monitor it. If you don't measure it, it doesn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the big surprises was the increase because provinces and territories have those plans in place. They took the steps forward they could within their fiscal constraints, and they all spent more money. What was even more surprising is in the 2013 budgets, we did not see cutbacks, and we did see some increases. Not big increases, but some modest increases, and we didn't see slowdown in the early childhood education file, broadly defined. Whereas just about everything else there's been big cuts and in the public spending, but not in this one. So that's interesting. One of the things we talk about in funding is the difference between fee subsidy funding, where things are fee-based and the family's low income, government gives them a subsidy, versus program funding. Practically the only program that's fee-based is childcare, licensed childcare. All the rest receive program funding, direct funding. May not be enough, it may not have increased, whatever, but you get a program budget for a family resource center, for a CAP-C program, et cetera, et cetera. Childcare is different. It's based on a market model, and where there's a fee, and what the market can bear is really what the fees tend to be. In some provinces are really moving away from the balance on fee subsidy for childcare and putting much more money in program funding and reducing the fees, and that tends to help with higher salaries. Certainly Quebec's done that, Prince Edward Island's done that, and Manitoba's done that. And they all have caps on what parents can pay. Now, Quebec is the low-cost one, but both PEI and Manitoba also have a cap on what families pay, and then they have direct money that goes to the programs for childcare. And they also have salary scales, so there's some equity. Whereas in the rest of the country, you can be making $11 an hour and you can be making $18 an hour, and you're at the same level and you have the same qualification. So that's happening. We have seen one of the trends is modest salary increases, and you bet we still care. The Child Care Human Resource Sector Council, which is now folded, but their last report on this did a survey of early childhood educators across the country and saw modest salary increases continue. We are seeing in some parts of the country more than others, but we are seeing slowly the salaries increase. They still remain very low for the value of the work that's done and for the educational requirements. The only province that spends more than 3% of its provincial budget on this file is Quebec at this time. Others are around 2%, and that includes what everybody's spending on public kindergarten. Access. Well, one of the goals for this is not just to have perfect programs for an elite few, which is what happens much of the time now, but to really make access much broader. Voluntary, yes. Not everybody wants the same thing. Not every parent is in the workforce, but they still want to access something. So wanting to think about how to increase the access to all of those components and ensure that they're all there, and that those programs that provide extra efforts to marginalized and vulnerable programs, how can we build them into the fabric of an integrated platform so it's more efficient for them to do that and they can be more effective, and that we're reaching all of the kids, okay? And doing extra efforts to reach those families who struggle most and may be marginalized and have the least very small social networks, etc. And that's part of, to increase the access, we need to monitor who's coming in the door and who's not, and then how do we reach out to bring those who are not coming in the door. And one of the things that happened in New Brunswick in the demonstration sites that have informed the policy change that's happening there is that was one of the big outcomes, is the public health early intervention program people saying they're able to reach more people with their allocated program time because they're in one place. They're not doing as much administrative stuff, organizing to get people, and so forth and so on. And we had some wonderful reports from families about how they used to have to go to 5 places, and one woman said, my caseworker was on my back to go to the early years center, and I told her I didn't want to go, but she wasn't going to get off my back, so I packed up the 3 kids and thought I'd go once. And I've been going ever since for a year, because this is the first time I felt welcome. I actually don't think I'm such a bad parent anymore as I used to think I was. And I couldn't get kids to all those damn appointments, and now we make all of them because the services are there. The speech and language I know that speech and language is going to be there for one child, and the other 2 have other activities they can do, etc., etc. And that story was repeated over and over again. And when we talk to the professionals, they say, hey, I saw 20% more families in the same amount of time as a year ago because they were all in one place. It was a lot easier, etc., etc. Even so, that's increases access. We have spent a lot of time here and in other jurisdictions talking about universality versus targeted programs. And it's not either or. You can have universal programs and target within it. We have a public health care system like that, right? It's available to all of us, but we might not have used it for a year because we weren't sick, or we only used it for the annual checkup. But then if you get sick, you might use it a lot. That doesn't mean we should all use it a lot. So it's the same way with special ed in the education system. It's targeted to kids who need it within a universal platform. So it's not about choosing universal versus targeted. It's about how we can target within universal so that we can reach the kids who need it with what they need. Access for children with special needs. It is not good enough, in my humble opinion, to provide in early childhood to provide opportunities for children with special services. Publicly funded programs need to be required to do that, as they are in PEI in Manitoba. It's built into the regulation. They are required to accommodate children with special needs. They're provided with resources. In Ontario, there's all kinds of resources, but it's the program's discretion whether they take the child or not. And that's not good enough for publicly funded programs. So that's part of access too. And this again, the integrated program delivery platform, I think I've explained what I mean by that and how that can improve access. And we are, as a trend, everywhere across the country seeing the education system reach down and provide, in some cases, school-based program delivery platform, and in some cases providing direct delivery of early education and parenting programs. And I've talked about BC. Alberta doesn't have a policy on education providing programs for kids, or a particularly worked out policy for providing 3-year-old and 4-year-old and 2-year-old programs. But it's happening a lot. It's happening there by stealth almost. They're finding these bits and pieces of money, able to put it together from some special ed money for younger kids, and all of a sudden they can open up a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old program for everybody in the catchment area. In some cases, the school district. Very interesting. 300 school authorities in that province. And they have more autonomy to spend their money than anywhere else. So it's very interesting what's happening there. You have the education system here reaching down. Okay, the reaching down with Kids Start. Did I get that right? The Kinder Start. Kinder Start is a 6-week, I think, program that for children prior to school entry. There also the education ministry here is working on a curriculum framework. Now I understand that really is working collaboratively with child and youth services and working together on that. And I'm going to come back to that when I get into the learning environment. But we do see education reaching down and figuring out. Education has figured, as a sector, has figured out this matters. They figured out, I think, as a sector, that by thinking about early childhood and bringing families into the system one way or another earlier is only going to improve what happens in schools. I think we're on our way to that. We've had a lot of concern about schoolification, pushing down. We're actually seeing the opposite in some jurisdictions. Early childhood education is pushing up and making a difference in how things are delivered there. So that's happening. I'm going to move on. How am I doing for time? Of course, I didn't bring a watch up. Right? Okay. Learning environment. We're seeing across the country increasing professionalism. We all know, and I think I'm preaching to the choir, we all know it's the educator, this responsiveness, knowledge, skills of the educator that matters most to quality. There is no magic bullet curriculum. There is no magic bullet physical environment. What matters most is the cognitive and emotional sensitivity of the educator that works directly with the kids. Okay? And we're seeing an increasing professionalism. The number of people with qualifications is going up, and certification requirements are going up. In this province, in your child care strategy, has required that everybody have, I think it's level 1 certification, which is a 1-year certificate, which is is a huge jump up from what used to be here. And that's pretty recent. We're seeing those kinds of push up across the country. We're seeing more degree programs go on, early childhood education degree programs. It's not, PEI is considering making it a requirement for supervisors in their early years centers. I understand that's under consideration. And more of those folks are having that requirement. I've talked about salaries before. We're seeing the curriculum frameworks, early learning frameworks emerge across the country to people from outside of Canada. They don't understand why we have one for every jurisdiction, why we don't have one pan-Canadian one. They just don't get Canada and the fact we don't have a central education. But we're seeing people are borrowing from each other and building on each other. And yours is under development now. I have not seen it. I'd love to see it sometime soon. But my understanding is it's a 0 to 8 focus. Okay? So it's got application in the primary grades, and it's got application not just for licensed childcare and preschools, but for family resource programs. It's going to reach across and be piloted in all of those different settings. And that's a unique, nobody else has done that. People have talked about how it can be, but it's kind of like an afterthought, or it happens later. This went out the door with that goal in mind. So it seems like you've really thought about it, looked around at what others are doing, and seen this as a good idea. None of the early learning frameworks are focusing on subject areas and, do they have the early literacies? Those may be embedded in it, but they're really focused around habits of mind or developmental domains or that sort of thing. And they're all very play-based, purposeful play-based. And we're seeing that have an impact on some of the kindergarten curriculums, notably in Ontario and BC. Really, those have changed quite dramatically because of the push-up of what's happening in early learning. And we're seeing this pedagogical focus. It varies from place to place about child-directed and educator-guided. And it varies. And I care more about the skills of the educator than where they come on this balance myself. But we're not seeing teacher-directed pedagogy emerging as the goals in early childhood education. And that's pretty much a theme across the country. Okay, accountability. Now, here's where there are some real cultural differences between education and early childhood education. In early childhood education, we talk about how we're doing. We really look at monitoring program quality more than we do to see how the program's doing. We don't look at child outcomes to tell us how our program's doing. I don't know in this province. I do know in Ontario, many people look at the grade 3 reading and literacy scores of the kids and make judgment about the quality of the education. Okay, so there is a real cultural difference there that in how we look at outcomes, and it's no province actually does any kind of quality assessment or program evaluation of what's going on in their kindergarten programs. They may do it informally. There may be ways within school districts, but there's no formal assessment, or are they even meeting minimum standards and that sort of thing. What's coming across as a theme across many of our jurisdictions is looking at pedagogical documentation or narration or learning stories or those whatever you want to call it as being the way to monitor how kids are doing, to really uncover the learning and document it well based on what the kids can do and say and know, rather than what they don't know and do and say. Okay? And that's a very different approach than developmental and skill checklists or assessments. And some people are successfully merging them, but definitely that there's a lot of interest in documentation and narration, and it's drifting up into kindergarten and primary school. Lots of different ways to review program from a standardized measure like the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale, which has been around for a long time, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with, or the assessment tool that's being consultative assessment tool that's being, it's collaborative assessment tool in New Brunswick. That is a mistake. Collaborative assessment tool in New Brunswick, where they took their early learning framework and the principles in it, and they went and talked to practitioners and post-secondary educators and researchers and identified what would it look like if we were meeting those principles. And they put together guidelines for it. So it's not a checklist, it's not a standardized measure, but it's a tool that's interactive, that gets you thinking and talking with your colleagues and looking what you're doing. And that should be out soon. Provinces, in terms of, I forgot to mention child outcomes, a lot of provinces, in fact, I think we're just about at everybody, is either collecting early development instrument or the early years evaluation. One of those two tools that is meant to take a broad level snapshot of where kids are at as at the 5-year-old kind of mark before they go into the formal school system. EDI is not meant to be a curriculum tool to guide curriculum. It's very much meant to be look at how the population of kids are doing, just like public health looks at where are we at on birth outcomes, what's our low birth weight rate across the region. Okay, so it's not meant to be used as a skill checklist. EYE can be used either to aggregate up and look at the population or as more of an individual checklist. And pretty much every jurisdiction is doing that now. Finally, we have system monitoring. Every province and territory that signed the Early Child Development Agreement in 2000 is expected, and the multilateral child care framework is expected to make a report, public report, about how they're spending the money and how kids are doing. And that's happening at various levels across the country. And finally, we have the Early Childhood Education Report that was launched in the earlier study that looks at 19 benchmarks across the country and how provinces and territories are doing. And that will be released again in 2014. And this is what it looked like in 2011. And first is governance, and you see the blue bars, and this really looked at, is it a unified oversight? Is there a policy framework that's comprehensive? Is there anything happening on the local regional stuff and that sort of thing? The second one was funding. The benchmark there was, is the jurisdiction spending at least 3% of the provincial budget on early childhood education? And is there program funding, or is it all fee subsidy? What are the salaries like? Are they, I think it was 60% of what teachers' salaries are, was the benchmark there. The next one was access. Are over 50% of the kids between 2 and 4 able to access an early childhood education program? Is there a requirement that publicly funded programs provide access to children with special needs? Learning environment looked at, is there a curriculum framework? What are the professional qualifications? What kinds of requirements are there for certification and professional development, professional learning opportunities, and that sort of thing? And then the accountability was, is that province reporting to the federal government? Are they monitoring all programs, including their publicly funded kindergarten programs, and are they collecting some sort of snapshot of where kids are at before they enter formal schooling, grade 1? We expect this is going to look quite different next time. We know that Newfoundland's already increased, and will look quite different next time. New Brunswick's going to look very different. BC may not look too different. And we know, and so forth and so on. And that these are all collected, these data are collected from public sources, reviewed with provinces, but collected from public sources and national longitudinal surveys and so forth and so on. And that work is being conducted by the Atkinson Center with support from foundations, and will continue to come out every 3 years. There are 3 sources of information that might, if you want to know more about this, there are a lot of resources on the Atkinson Center website. There's a policy monitor that keeps track of what's happening in every jurisdiction and if something's happened in your jurisdiction and it's not up there, shoot an email in. And then there's the Starting Strong 3 toolbox, which gives you lots of examples of what's happening in all of these areas in many, many, many countries, and it's very useful. So that is something that, if you're interested in that. The other thing you can do is get on the Atkinson Center listserv, and you get a weekly bulletin of various things. It takes a couple of minutes to scan through. There may only be one thing you're interested in opening up, but it really does collect most of the developments that's happening across the country. And if there's something that's happening here you'd like broadcast so other people can see it across the country, you can send it in. So that is the end of what I have to say.
Just going to open it up for any comments or questions for a few minutes, since Jane has certainly met her time frame. So any thoughts, Michael?
One question for clarification. When you were talking about governance and the split governance, were you talking about the K-12 between the K-12 system and the early childhood system? Was that where the problem was?
Well, it varies all over the place. The split might be K to 12 is over here and everything else is over here. Very seldom is it that clean. It's mostly we have K to 12, but they're also responsible for early learning. Some things are over in public health. So it usually means it's in more than 2 places. But yeah, that's one split jurisdiction. But then it's very seldom that clean. We usually have 3 or 4 when we take into account where family resource centers are located, and in many, like Newfoundland and BC in particular, have the early learning framework, and some of that work happening, or the Great Play Project and so forth happens out of education, and childcare and family resource are in child and youth services. BC has, and public health has a role here too for early intervention, as I understand, and those sorts of things. So it's usually more. It's usually not that easy a split. It's usually more than that.
Anybody else?
You got.
Jean, just to clarify then, so you said in building on the question that it hasn't worked anywhere else, that didn't have the system hasn't worked anywhere within an integrated ministry. So just to be clear, is that education? Is the ministry or
In most jurisdictions, it ends up in it's building on the platform. And I didn't get into some of this. There's lots of downsides. Education is a big monolithic system in many places. Let's face it. But the train runs every day. There is infrastructure in place. They exist in communities. So generally speaking, it has been education. Now in some South American countries, it has veered more towards public health, but they don't have a strong public education doesn't reach most of the people most of the time. There's a lot of private delivery. So public health has provided more of a platform. In European countries that have managed to have real reach down below 3 years. Yeah, they've moved into the education system. Denmark is somewhat of an anomaly and had it, but has had it 0 to 6 separate from their education, but they have some common educator qualifications. Well, they tend to go hand in hand. So to do one without the other, because there 3 things are involved: the salary cap, the fee cap, and more direct program funding. You know, and it becomes more standardized. And some programs who find themselves not liking the rigidity of that, of getting, and because they'd like to be able to charge more, because they have serving families that can pay more, and so they could charge more, and they could pay some higher salaries and that sort of thing. And once you come into a more publicly managed system, you have some ceilings. And that was a growing pain for the largest nonprofit group in PEI that is dealing with that, because they had more people with ECE than are recognized in the program funding, et cetera. So there's some painfulness in that, but you do have to really bring them in together and get the program funding so that it covers some of the base costs, and then you have the parent fee at a cap, and then you have the subsidy to support those who are low income, and bringing the salaries in provides some equity. You don't have Susan, who's working in a center that has higher building costs, making $5 an hour less than Sally, who's working somewhere else who doesn't have those costs. And usually what happens, there's some form of negotiation around those salaries.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jane.
Okay. Take this.
Jane will be back as part of our panel discussion later on, so we'll get into more detail. Yes. Oh, yes. Okay, sure.
Jane, if I'm correct, Quebec has non-integrated other education, is that?
That's correct.
They're under social family policy?
Yeah, a family. I can see the French name. It's a family ministry, and they have education, and it's one of their challenges. Oh yeah, it's recognized as one of their challenges, and there was a lot of there were a lot of people in Quebec who were pleased that they weren't way out ahead, because they see challenges and they want to see more integration, and they were pleased that they were not at the perfect, that they had room to go, and that's where they were 10 out of 15 on the index, and part of it was because they're still operating in silos, and now there's some real tension as they bring in a 4-year-old program, because they don't have that cross-integration, absolutely. Quebec is not a panacea. Lots we can learn from Quebec, both about what to do and what not to do, and they've had some real good successes. But this is their big challenge, absolutely. Okay. And many are talking, yeah.
Thanks, Jane, for that clarification. I didn't say at the outset, we will be doing a proceedings report here today, so collecting all the input, as well as the presentations will be available as part of that proceedings report and will be posted on the Jimmy Pratt Foundation website. So just to let you know that this information will be available. So now I'm going to call on Bertrand Bruce, and Bertrand has come over from PEI to talk about what approaches they have underway in our next door neighbor, Island Province, and something that certainly we can learn from. And if you look at the table that Jane had just presented as part of the early year study, we can see that PEI has certainly moved quite a long way in their system. So obviously there's something we can and should learn from. Berna has a very extensive career in government and outside of government. I'm sure she's relieved on both accounts, and we're certainly happy to have her today with us. So Berna, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It's a great opportunity for me to be here. I'm from the other island, and we are a smaller island, but we are an island. And I think we have an awful lot in common. There's a mentality around islanders and a fierce sense of pride. So I'm very happy to be able to be here to talk to you a little bit about what we did. I also want to say at the outset that what you're doing is just so absolutely important. There will be days when you probably feel discouraged, but don't ever let it get you down. Remember that what you're doing is going to make the difference in lives of children and generations for years to come. And I absolutely love the title of your discussion paper, because the early years really do last a lifetime. And we know that. I'm preaching to the choir, I know, but it's something very important. As mentioned, I was a career public servant. I had about 20 years at the deputy minister level, worked with governments of various political stripes. But I also have a life outside of work, and as a mother and a grandmother now. Grandmothers are just as fierce, as mothers, I've discovered, when it comes to early childhood education. We've got more time to meddle, which is part of it. And also very actively involved with one of our largest nonprofit organizations in PEI that has built that integrated system of services for children from early development through prenatal, actually, right now up until the end of grade 6. So we've got a very large organization that's had the opportunity to work through a lot of this for many, many years. So I have that kind of perspective, which I'll share with you, which is both the government hat and the community hat. The change in PEI was absolutely monumental. It wasn't incremental. It was what we would call revolution rather than evolution. And basically, it turned everything in the system upside down. Government made the decision to do it fast rather than to do it in incremental steps, and to do it all at once. And I think that's part of the reason why it has been as successful as it has. The improvements were absolutely dramatic. When you take a look at the Early Childhood Education Index that Jane just showed you, 3 years ago we would have been second from the bottom. We were just sitting on top of Newfoundland, and in the space of a very short period of time, we've now gone to being second highest in the country. Quebec in front of us all, but that's okay. Quebec has many things that we would all strive to have, and it's good to have somebody that's way out there that you can kind of try to get to. But we're very happy that we've come as far as we have. There's a real temptation, though, when we start talking about PEI, that people will shut down and say, oh, well, yeah, but you're just a small province. I mean, you guys can do it, but we could never do it here. And I would ask you not to do that today. We may be small, but I'll tell you, we're just as complex. We have all the questions around Aboriginals. We've got huge poverty issues, literacy issues. We've got complex systems of government. we may not have 100 of everything, but we certainly have the complexity. And I'll tell you, being a small province, putting on my deputy minister's hat, has a whole lot of other challenges because everybody knows the premier, everybody can get to him. And when you're trying to do good public policy, it's really challenging if he's been talking to somebody at the gym that morning who has a completely different point of view. So there are challenges when you come from a small jurisdiction. So what I'm going to do is kind of describe a little bit about where we started, what some of those huge changes were, and then how we got there. And this is from my perspective. Other people may have a different perspective, but I'm hoping that there's something here that's going to be helpful for you. All right, now, technology is not my thing. Oh, look at that. But you have me well set up, Robin. Thank you. So in the beginning, we had the highest percentage of regulated spaces per capita in Canada, but we also had the lowest investment per space. And what that meant was that the centres had very few resources to work with. There were major issues around quality and huge issues around wages like everywhere else. We had the highest percentage of working mothers with young children. That's partly a reflection of our seasonal economy. An awful lot of our jobs are minimum wage types of jobs, so people have to work in families to make ends meet. We had a series of private kindergarten operated by profit and not-for-profit centers. In the cities, we had an oversupply, and in rural PEI, we had an undersupply. We had very low wages for our staff, very high fees in some cases for our parents. We had a child care subsidy program that the rates and the income thresholds had not been updated since about 2005. We have about 1,300 to 1,400 live births per year in PEI, and when we began, there were 91 regulated spaces for infants in the province. And we have very few of our working mothers who can take advantage of a one-year leave with employment insurance because many people are working in sectors where that's just simply not available to them. So they have to go back to work. There were no spaces in regulated areas for infants, and most of them were being cared for either in unregulated spaces or by grandparents and family. Special needs children were really hard to place. A lot of the centers just absolutely refused to take them because they were not perhaps funded and not really helped to understand how to integrate them into the programs. And we did have that fragmented governance. We had the Department of Education involved in some things. We had social services divisions involved in others. Regulation was completely separate from operations, and that was separate from subsidies and curriculum. So we were just kind of like pretty far behind on all of those indices. So where are we now? The first key step I think that government took when there was a change of government was to create a Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. And the Early Childhood Development title was taken very deliberately, as I'm understanding, to include the whole aspect of learning, child care, the whole developmental range, so that it included all of the services that are provided to young children. Government coming in, knowing that they wanted to do something, one of the first things that they did was appoint a commissioner to look at the question of kindergarten. And the commissioner's job was to make recommendations after talking to people about how to implement a kindergarten program in the province. Interesting, the person that they chose to do it was the leader of the opposition party, and she was a teacher by trade. So in hindsight, and a lot of this is hindsight, it really is interesting that she was able to do this work and not have it become a partisan kind of exercise. So it really was truly an objective professional perspective on what to do with kindergarten and PEI. And as a result of her work, we ended up with full-day kindergarten in the schools and using a play-based curriculum. Like, this took a year of consultation and lots of toing and froing, and it wasn't an easy sell, but the final conclusion was one that really worked. We did have a whole lot of private for-profit operators in the system and lots of non-profit operators. And one of the things that was put into place right off the bat was a licensed retirement fund. So for those people who were private for-profit operators in the system, they had three options when the changes came in. One was they could have their license bought out. So lump sum cash investment, get out of the business, close down your center. They could convert to the new model of early years centers, or they could remain in business as a private operation. A lot of the reports recommended that the whole system go to not-profit, but that was a little bit too much for government to handle, so it is still possible for people to remain in business as a private operation. If they wanted to get out, they had 30 days to make up their mind. So it was quick. It wasn't going to be a lot of toing and froing. There's money on the table. Make your decision very quickly. And it wasn't as bad as it sounds, because a lot of the private for-profit people would say there's no profit in this anyway. And they were losing money. They were really struggling. So for many people, having the idea of a lump sum to get out was not a bad idea. And many of them ended up then going either into the kindergarten system or working for other early years centers. So it ended up being a very good thing. And from a policy perspective, many of the centers who took that option were probably the ones that had perhaps more struggles and more difficulty providing a quality program anyway. So it kind of evened the system out a little bit. The existing programs could apply then to become early years centers, and this is the terminology that's being used. And if you were approved to become an early years center, you had a very stable, predictable funding, which would cover the gap between your regulated wages and overhead and regulated parent fees. Programming was going to be following an early learning framework and provincial curriculum. Early years centers are across the province, and special care was taken in rural areas to make sure that there were, in fact, early years centers. And similar to you in rural Newfoundland, I mean, if you've got somebody who's involved in the fishing industry, they're on the water at 5 o'clock in the morning, so having childcare available to you at 9:30 is not really very helpful. So making sure that the early years centers and the rural areas had really different types of hourly operations to accommodate people. Most of the centers had to have a minimum of 40 children, unless they were in rural areas. But all early years centers were required to have special needs children, as Jane mentioned, but also were required to take infants, to try to deal with some of the questions around infants. And again, the centers were compensated accordingly. Parent advisory committees were required in all of the centers, and that allowed parents to have an opportunity to have some clear input. Where possible, government took the decision that the early years centers would be located in the schools. And this was really helpful in rural areas. I imagine it's the same in Newfoundland. You know, people are starting to migrate more and more to the centers. You've got these beautiful buildings that are partially empty. And the whole goal was, rather than creating a whole new infrastructure, let's use the infrastructure that we currently have. And a fund was set up to help the schools to remodel to accommodate little tiny people, because obviously your playground equipment is going to need to be different. One of the interesting things is all the strollers that now start to appear in the hallways in the schools. Children have muddy feet, so the janitors have to be prepared for that. So there were all kinds of challenges around that, but it really helped to make a lot of sense and really helped to keep some of those smaller schools open in some of the smaller communities. And the final thing that was really important here was, on this sheet at least, was parental choice. You can't tell parents what's best for their kids. You can't tell grandparents what's best for their grandchildren either, but you really can't tell parents. And parents needed to know that they would always have an option, if it was available in their area, to go to an early years center, that they could continue to use private daycare. And those centers are licensed, but they don't have to follow the same kind of curriculum. The fees are not regulated by government. So the private centers, there are still some, and parents have every right to use those. And there are all of the informal changes that became available for, or informal arrangements that are still available for people to use. In terms of other things, we did, as Jane was mentioning in response to another question, a 5-year wage grid was put in place with annual increments of 3% per year. And the wage grid was developed to recognize levels of training and years of experience. So just one of the examples, if you were a certified staff person with a 2-year program, the average before all of this was about $12 an hour. And afterwards, the range was established between $15 an hour and $16.88. And then since then, we've had these 3% increments. So a fairly, in some ways, very modest when you think about what we expect of our early childhood educators, but at the same time, a fairly substantial investment in terms of improving the wages. There were also new training programs instituted for staff, which allowed all staff to become certified over the next few years. And it created an integrated ladder from entry level to post-diploma and baccalaureate so that people could actually see themselves moving up a system. One of the things that government did have as its centerpiece was something called infant homes, and this is the one that never worked. The whole goal was that they would establish regulated homes where an individual person could have 3 infants, and there would be support provided financially as well as professional development and training, and it never took off. So one of the things that we still have to work on is infant spaces. When you look at some of the literature coming out, there's great pride in the fact that we've doubled the number of infant spaces with the early years centers, but that means we've gone from 91 to 180, and we still have 1,400 children being born every year. So that's kind of a quick overview of where we are. And how did we get there? Well, it's really interesting. I call it the perfect storm. And when you look at it in hindsight, it looks so deliberate. But this wasn't deliberate at all. It was a whole lot of things happening that came together. Everybody was ready when the opportunity presented itself to do something different, and it actually allowed wonderful things to happen. So no one factor, a lot of this stuff was years in the making, but when the opportunity presented itself, it was like everything came together. The stars aligned and people were ready just to jump right in. So from my perspective, there were really 7 things that allowed it to happen, and I'll quickly run through each of them. The first one was political will. And on this one, I can't begin to tell you how many years people spent working on this whole question of early childhood education and its importance. A lot of conversations were happening with the premier of the day, of course, but all kinds of conversations were happening with the premier, who at that time was still in opposition. So as the, and I'm putting on my community hat now, as a community group, when we were trying to start change, we would of course talk to government. We'd go and meet with the premier and the ministers, but we also made sure that we spent lots of time talking to people in the opposition office as well, because in any legislative assembly, there are representatives from more than one political party. So you need to make sure you've got everybody on side. Then when the premier became the premier, he actually personally took this on because he had been well versed and well prepared. He also did end up becoming a new dad, which probably didn't help and hurt any, but he really had a commitment to this before he became a dad. So I think it's just a personal thing. He saw it for what it was in many areas, the opportunity to develop children and give them the best start of life. A key part, though, of our labor force strategy. We're a small province, we're seasonal. If we want to start trying to compete in the world, we have to have a labor force that's better educated and better trained. Our literacy levels are abysmal. We still have, I think, something like 60% of our adults are functionally illiterate in our province. So, I mean, they can read, but they can't read well enough to necessarily function. So we have to do some major things around our education of young children. He was well aware that we needed to have a strong labor force in order to be able to build our economy. So he was looking at it from the perspective of the child, but also from all of those other aspects as well. Through time, it's really interesting because many people will say now that after 7 years in government, this has become the premier's legacy. I don't think it started out that way, but it has actually become something that he's extremely proud of. We also had a couple of key ministers on side. So these were people who, again, when they were in opposition, we would have been chatting with them. But as they came into government, they weren't necessarily the ministers in the portfolios that you'd think you'd need to have. but they were ministers who just had an absolute passion for this. And one of the things I learned from my deputy hat is that when you talk about things like health and education, every cabinet minister wants to be the minister in those portfolios. So the fact that you've got only 2 people named doesn't mean that there aren't, 10 or 15 other people around the table who want to have that job and have very strong opinions. So you need to be able to work with them. We had 2 key ministers that were just absolutely wonderful. And they had teaching backgrounds. So again, really interesting as you start to think about who you can work with, who do you have sitting around your cabinet table who has that kind of a background. Policy board and cabinet spent hours on this. In our province, most of the work is done before you ever get to policy board and cabinet, and policy board and cabinet have, conversations and discussions, but this one was back no less than 15 times, which was a record. And part of that, I think, was because it's a very complicated field. All ministers were looking at it from the perspective of what's going to happen in their district, what's going to happen to parents, what's going to happen to kids, what's going to happen to the centers. So there was a really strong perspective here in terms of making sure that they understood it. They did decide to do it fast, which was really hard, again, for the sector and really hard for staff and government. But again, in hindsight, turned out to be one of the best decisions that they made. And they knew they needed to have a plan, and the plan was called the Preschool Excellence Initiative, which is available online. The second factor, really, I think, was that decision to move kindergarten into the school system. We had been talking in our province about what to do with kindergarten for no less than 20 years. Every time there was an election, it came up as an issue, or if it didn't come up as an issue, there were lobby groups asking why it didn't come up as an issue. So actually doing something about kindergarten was a pretty key factor. But we also knew that for many of the centers, they were going to be losing up to 40% of their children. And we also knew that for many of the centers, the 5-year-olds were in fact subsidizing the cost for the younger children, because the way the ratios were working, the fees were the same, but you didn't need to have as many staff providing the services. So we knew that there was going to be all kinds of challenges there. And there were major concerns around financial viability. If you take all of these 5-year-olds out of the centers, what's going to happen to them? There were real concerns, particularly in the rural areas where a town might only have 1 child care center. If you take all the 5-year-olds out, is it going to fold? There were also major issues around, once you move kindergarten into the school system, then all of a sudden the school system has to be hiring kindergarten teachers. And the decision was taken to have them become part of the education system. So the salaries were really good. There was an agreement made that for people who didn't have the baccalaureate training, that there would be an accelerated program for them where they could get it within 2 years. And what ended up happening, of course, is a lot of your very best early childhood educators ended up going into the school system, which meant for people who really wanted to have the best educators in the early years, all of a sudden you've got a real shortage of trained and qualified people. So the decision was taken that you need to do something really quickly to develop staff. And government hired a consultant at this point in time to take a look at what the impact of moving kindergarten into the school system was going to be on the rest of our province. The person who has done, Kathy Flanagan-Rochon, who many of you may know, spent a lot of time interviewing parents. There were surveys done. She made a lot of recommendations on how to proceed. Many of them were taken, and that became the early years report, which basically formed the basis for government's plan. The third key factor, I think, was support within the bureaucracy. And putting on my deputy hat, while elected officials are there to make the decisions, and we all know that that's why people are elected, they need to have information. And they collect information from people in their constituencies who they talk to on the weekend, but they also need to have really good policy options. They need to have really good data, analysis, and advice from staff and departments. When the opportunity presents itself, a new minister, a new government coming in with a commitment to do something in this area, you can't take 2 or 3 years for the government bureaucracy to figure out what needs to be done. People actually need to be ready to go when the decision is made. And I'm sure Newfoundland is like PEI in this area. We have a professional, nonpartisan public service. People know that they're there to provide service to the government in power, that government, the elected officials, make the decisions. But they also know that there is a whole range of policy that's good policy that may not be supported by the current government, but that is still good policy and needs to have work done on it. So there were those people in the PEI government as well, and they worked really, really hard before this became a possibility, but certainly when it became a possibility. They had the information, the passion, they knew what the right things were to do, and they became part of moving it forward. I know that you have those people in your government too, and probably some of them are here today, but it's really important to find those kindred spirits and work with them so that when the opportunity presents itself, everybody's ready to go. Nothing worse than having a government ready to go and the system not being ready, and then you get that lag, and then all of a sudden it becomes not a priority anymore. The fourth key factor, I think, for PEI moving this forward was what I call community and stakeholders, but both support and resistance. There was real tension, and in some cases I would say almost animosity, between the not-for-profit centers and the for-profit centers. Even that whole concept of profit for some of the for-profit centers was a real issue because they were losing money. But nevertheless, they were a business providing a service rather than a nonprofit providing a service. Some of the centers were very profitable for their owners, and others were experiencing all kinds of losses. The nonprofit organization that I work with called Chances had funding from a private foundation, which I'll talk about in a minute, to demonstrate the benefits of delivering an early childhood education program within schools. And we had started it in one of our inner city schools, one of our schools that really struggled, typical inner city. And we had plans then to roll it out in the next phase to another 4 schools. Once we opened up the first one, the for-profit centers mounted a very strong lobby to the Premier and to ministers saying that this is completely unfair. Here was a center that had access to free space, and they didn't have access to free space, so all of a sudden government was providing an unfair advantage and an unfair subsidy to this early learning center located in the schools. This was relatively early on, and they were successful actually in shutting the program down. We fought really hard to maintain the one program that we did have in that school, and we were able to maintain it. But the for-profit lobby actually completely shut down the possibility of doing these programs in any of the other schools. At the time, we were angry. This is my nonprofit hat. I have to tell you what I'm speaking from, I guess. But from a nonprofit perspective, we were really angry that something that we thought had so much value could be shut down by something that perhaps had a different objective. And we were quite discouraged. What ended up happening was the private for-profit centers that really were profitable kind of created their own association. And they started to lobby really, really hard against any kind of early childhood education in the schools. They had some early support from the politicians, which made it even harder for us in the nonprofit world. But then what ended up happening was their dialogue became more focused on the financial viability of the centers. And the dialogue from the nonprofit organizations was focused on what's best for kids. And in the final analysis, it turned out to be a wonderful thing because politicians in general, and the Premier, I guess, in particular, began to be quite concerned about the motives of some of the larger for-profit centers and the fact that the conversations were always around money and financial viability. And then when Kathy Flanagan-Rochon did her report, she actually recommended that there not be any private centers left, that they all go to a nonprofit model. Government wasn't quite prepared to go that far, but they did actually support then, as a model, the whole idea of nonprofit located in the schools. So it turned out to be a good thing. Parents were supportive, and the Early Childhood Education Association was also very supportive of what government was trying to do. So that was an interesting interesting period of time. The fifth thing that I want to talk about is Fraser Mustard and Margaret McCain, because they, from my perspective, were absolutely key in terms of making this happen and creating a willingness, even an understanding of what all this is about. Again, with my deputy hat, it's really important anytime you're taking something to government to make a decision that you try to make the case so clear that there's only one possible right answer in terms of how you should proceed. And Fraser was able to do that. So Fraser and Margaret came to the island numerous times, both with the previous government and with the current government. And Fraser did his wonderful thing around the science of brain development, where, you know, those first 3 years, how critical they are, the pathways developing and all that kind of stuff. And it was absolutely wonderful to watch him in action. And at one of the cabinet meetings, there was one, everybody's got them, right? Like there's one minister that you know is just not going to get on board. He's just going to be skeptical. He's going to be the person who will present you with the most difficult questions. Well, after Fraser finished speaking, he jumped on board and he stayed on board forever because he got it. Like the penny dropped for him that if we don't do something for these children between the ages of 0 and 3, then we're going to end up trying to play catch up with these children for the rest of their lives, and where they're going to end up. So he was just absolutely wonderful. And then Margaret there talking about, you know, how you can actually make things happen. The research was really hard for people to dispute, so having that was absolutely critical. When Fraser and Margaret came to the island, we also made sure that they met with senior officials. So it wasn't just the elected politicians getting the information, it was also people within government. They did lots of media interviews, we did community groups. So again, trying to get everybody on the same page in terms of what was possible here. Fraser, too bad he couldn't be with us to do this again, but his work will live on forever. And at a conference in Toronto, I heard Craig Alexander, who I gather is coming here in the spring, speak. And he may be in some ways the new Fraser. His presentation and commitment to this issue from an economic and financial point of view is incredible. And in the current environment, you know, that may be a really good message to have. So when he comes, you know, trying to find people who can help him get onto government's agenda would be really helpful. The next thing that I think was a really important factor was funding from the Wallace and Margaret McCain Family Foundation. This is a really interesting one because in government, we never liked funding from private foundations because we figured that they would be doing things that we would never be able to do as government. They would set the bar way too high. There may have been some jealousy as well, because when a private foundation is involved, people can be creative. You don't have the same requirements from accountability. The Auditor General is not going to be down your back. But it's a tough one for people in government to accept the fact that there's a role here that private foundations can play. But again, working with the McCain Foundation, and people were very professional, Jane and Carrie presented numerous times, it became a partnership. So rather than something that government had to be afraid of or worried about, it really did, in fact, become a partnership with a private foundation. We, as a community organization, in Chances, had that advantage of having some funding from the McCain Foundation that actually allowed us to do things that we'd never be able to do ourselves. Because we're a nonprofit organization, we do not have money. We had all kinds of flexibility and all kinds of passion. So having the funding from the McCain Foundation really allowed us to do that demonstration site at Prince Street School. It's allowed us to do all kinds of things that we would never have been able to do ourselves. And because everything that we do with the McCain Foundation, there's an evaluation and research component to it, that information then actually informs public policy. And I think it has had a huge impact to PEI because it really has made the difference in terms of how some of the things have unfolded. I think when you have a private foundation, it can provide local evidence. And this is something, it's probably the same here as it is at home. we really need to have the science and the national evidence that, you know, people like Fraser and the McCain Foundation bring. But boy, if you can't demonstrate how it works on PEI, you're not going to have anybody listening to you. So having the ability to actually do those demonstration sites, to have the data and say, go to cabinet and say, this is what's actually happening to these children at Prince Street School, it made all the difference in the world. So you folks are really lucky here to have the Pratt Foundation, and I'm sure that there are other foundations involved as well. It's just really an important component, and it allows you to do things you'd never be able to do otherwise. The seventh one and the last one is the school system. And this one's kind of fun because the school system was really skeptical. Certainly in PEI, it was a K-12 system. It wasn't a K-12 system, it was a 1-12 system forever. And kindergarten was just being introduced, and not everybody was happy about that. So they were really very, very skeptical about anything to do with early childhood education. They were concerned about, you know, the noise that the kids were going to bring into the school. Again, the muddy boots. We had people, when we did our first program at Prince Street School, complaining about the strollers in the hall, because, you know, you do have strollers when you're looking, providing services for children. Hours of operation, it's not an 8:30 to 3:30. It's not just from September to June. So there's all kinds of issues when you start to work with the school system. So they were really skeptical. Again, we had started working with this one principal at Prince Street for a couple of years. And he finally came on side because, again, we had funding from a foundation to make it happen. So there was no financial cost to him and his school. And we were able to start an early years program in that inner city school, which is probably like inner city schools here, you know, high rates of immigration. I think right now there's something like 21 different languages being spoken in that very small inner city school. A lot of poverty issues, a lot of single parents. So, I mean, this was a school where, and I don't want to be, you know, creating a story, but there were all kinds of challenges in this school. So with the benefit of the funding, we were actually able to start here. We thought that was a good one. The decision was taken by the nonprofit organization to use the EYE to assess the children in this demonstration program in September, and then to do a similar assessment in June. And it was chosen particularly because they wanted to show the difference for individual children rather than looking at it from a population level. So we did despite the attempts to shut it down, we kept this one going, and we actually had the opportunity then to present to the elementary school principals. So in our education system, the elementary school principals come together a couple of times a year just to talk about issues that are specific to them. And we had the opportunity to present to them, and you could actually see the penny dropping that day, and I'll show you why. Most of the school principals were struggling with children coming into school with all kinds of behavioral problems, a sense that a lot of children were coming in not ready to learn, real concerns around trying to engage parents, that it seemed like for many children coming into grade 1 at that time, you know, the parents kind of dropped them at the door and said, okay, it's your problem now. So there were some real issues and challenges. And when we were able to show them the information that we had obtained from this tiny little pilot project, the reaction was incredible. So this was what we showed them. And oh, you're not going to be able to see that. Okay, so it's 2 slides. The first one is the September, and the second one is the June. And what it is, it's the EYE, which you people know better than I do. I know the terminology, but I don't really understand it. But if you take a look, the first column on the left in both of them is learning. It talks about the developmental level. So these are the kids that were in that program, and green meant that they were at level, and yellow meant that they've got challenges that need to be dealt with. The middle column is their social skills, behavior, and approaches to learning. And again, green would be for the children who are kind of ready to rumble, and yellow being for the ones who had some challenges. And then the third column is the physical development. So physical development was pretty good for everybody, not too many changes. But if you take a look at the learning and at the behavior, like most of these children came into that program with some pretty serious challenges. The way the program worked, it used a curriculum that we had borrowed from First Duty in Toronto. And it was a very deliberate curriculum, working with the child, assessing what their needs were, engaging the parents, working with the parents, making sure that there was a seamless kind of approach between home and the early years, but also that the principal in the school was aware of these children and the families that they came from. So in June, when we did the same assessment again, we were thrilled, but the principals were just absolutely amazed that all that was left was one child with one area that needed to be developed. And when they saw this, all of a sudden it just, wow, you know, these kids are going to come into grade 1 in those days. It's going to be so much easier for us as a school to be able to work with these children. So at the end of our presentation that day, we had a lineup of elementary school principals wanting to get involved in this program. It was just absolutely fabulous. And again, it shows that kind of local data, and when you have the benefit of funding from a private foundation to do things that don't fit with what government's currently doing, it really does give you the ammunition that you need to move forward. So that was the factors from my perspective, again, that really helped us to work. So if you take a look at the process that we used, and again, the process is ongoing, it's everything, and it will get you eventually there. Do not give up. The things that really seemed to help for us were the fact that we used evidence, both the science stuff from Fraser, but also the local information from our demonstration projects. People worked at all levels in government. They worked with cabinet ministers, policy board ministers, with bureaucrats, everybody in government that you could think of, trying to find people who were aligned with what we were trying to do, and then working with them, including all elected officials, not just people who are currently on the government side of house. Engaging the stakeholders, whether they want to be engaged or not. We had some really awful, difficult meetings. But again, if you don't bring the people who are opposed to you into the room, then you never really have the opportunity to understand what their issues are, whether or not there's any potential for common ground. And you know, again, trying to bring people in was really important. There was lots of resistance, and there still is some resistance out there, but being able to manage that and not give up is really important. Using networks, and this is something that I don't think any of us understood that we were doing, but how critical it was. Because when you take a look at the people in this room, you've got 55 or 60 people here today, you all have networks. I bet you anything that you know somebody in government or an elected official who, if you talk to them, would understand what it is that you wanted to do and come on side with you. And using those networks, so rather than trying to convince people who will never be convinced that this is a good idea, finding the people who are already aligned with you and working with them to actually make it happen. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I mean, you get tired of it because you're the choir and you think that everybody else should understand what it is that you're trying to do, but you have to keep constantly providing that communication and maintaining commitment. There are days when it gets pretty tiring, but don't give up and just kind of remember that you have to stay committed to what it is that you're doing. We still have challenges in PEI, so we've done a lot, but we have real challenges around infants still. We have about a third of our children in the early years centers, but that means we've got 2/3 of our children who aren't. There are real challenges from my perspective in terms of trying to provide affordable, while we have regulated rates for parents, for many parents those rates are still not manageable. We don't provide subsidized care to children in our social assistance program, which I think is a real miss. I mean, if you really wanted to start getting at some of those kids, the social assistance program is a good place to start. If you're working, you can get a subsidy, and many people are working and drawing assistance. Again, it's a real challenge in our province. But if you happen not to be working and you're on assistance, this is not open to you. So we need to do some work in that area, and the Premier is well aware of that as well. Trying to maintain all of this in tight financial times. As Jane's chart showed, we've been increasing the commitment from government. It hasn't declined, but I really would be somewhat concerned that if times continue to be tight, there will always be that lobby out there that says, well, it's cheaper to go back to some of these privately funded centers because they don't have the same investment from taxpayers. So there are challenges around that, and there will always be resistance, no matter what you're doing. There will always be people who don't necessarily agree with what you have in mind. So just a couple of thoughts around perspective. The system change is really difficult, and it takes a lot of time. So I would say for PEI to get here, it probably spanned 8-9 years. Margaret McCain was reminding me last night that they kept coming to PEI, and sometimes it felt like they were making a difference and sometimes it didn't. But in the final analysis, every time they came, there were a few more people who had some more information who started to think about it. Maybe not right away, but through the course of time. Really important to keep focusing on the positive, identifying the impacts of this type of a change on this, at the systemic level, at the program level, but particularly at the child and family level. So as people start talking about, well, this will never work, then start talking about, well, this is what is possible. And just keep moving towards that vision and bigger picture. The final comment that I would make is that there's a role for everybody in this. Government does have a responsibility to make decisions. It has a responsibility to set legislation, to provide funding to programs. Cabinet members do make decisions based on information available to them, whether it's coming to them from their own area of expertise or their own constituents, but they also will use the best information that they can get from the public service. So it's important for people outside the public service to also be providing information for public servants that they can then take forward as well. Community has to have passionate people, absolutely has to have passionate people who constantly say that the current system is not good enough. And while employees in government may think that, they're not allowed to say it. So this is a place where the community has a critical role. In fact, I used to love it when you'd have, this is the deputy's hat, when there was something that we were trying to accomplish within the bureaucracy, but we weren't getting anywhere. And then you'd find a really vocal organization or advocate outside who could actually do that lobbying and be the thorn in the side. And then lo and behold, when government decided it was time to do it, well, have we got a plan for you? So it's really important to recognize everybody's got a role, and you in the community can do that advocacy where people in government can't. And governments vary. You know, some governments will allow public servants to express opinions, and some governments don't want public servants to express opinions. So you have to be making sure that you as a community are constantly out there doing that. You need to be the voice for people who have no voice, because there are thousands of families out there who feel that they would never be listened to anyway, or who don't feel that they have the skills to take their ideas and concerns forward. So you have to be that voice for them. You have to be the ones who can demonstrate those different and creative solutions. And again, finding foundations or people who can help you fund that. One comment that somebody made to me years and years ago, which I've used throughout my life, remember that you very often are successful with gentle pressure relentlessly applied. So hang in there. Thank you very much.
So, Berna, that last comment sounds like my mother for sure. She's still gently applying it. Any sort of questions? We have time for one or two, and because Berna will be back in the panel. So any questions? Yes, Berna.
Apologies, I think you're talking about the advantage that the government, the early years sectors, but there tends to be, I find we talk about the transition to a public system, how to deal with, I think, grade 5 centers always talk about, but there seems to be this assumption that parent-run or not-for-profit community-run programs happily integrate themselves into the public system. And I know from experience that's not always the case, and I'm wondering what happened to not-for-profit managed centers in this scenario.
Again, the way it worked was organizations who wanted to become early years centers had to apply to become early years centers. So if you, and I'll use the example of the organization I was with, Chances, if we decided that we wanted to become an early years center, we had to understand that we were going to be required to follow a wage grid. We were going to have capped rates for our parents. We were going to have to follow a provincial curriculum. It was up to us then as a board to make the decision about whether or not we wanted to become an early years center, and obviously we did. And many boards were the same. So there were, I think right now we've got 45 early years centers across the province. But again, some of those private centers decided to get out of business. Some of the smaller community-run centers also went out of business because they made the decision that they weren't going to apply to become an early years center. And I think maybe that having to apply became a critical factor for anybody out there running a program that wanted to become part of the provincial system, because it became a very conscious decision then. It wasn't like you automatically were grandfathered in. You had to make a conscious decision that you were going to go this route and be prepared to take all that came with it. And it was a struggle. I know even on our own board, which I like to think is fairly progressive in this area, you know, some people were concerned about things, and we had to do a lot of negotiating. Like, and it's just simple things. You know, we had a commitment to our staff that we would provide 100% of their healthcare coverage. Well, that wasn't covered under the funding formula, but we wanted to make sure that we could maintain that. We gave all of our parents 2 weeks of unpaid childcare a year. We wanted to make sure that we could continue to do that. Some of our salaries were a bit higher. We wanted to make sure that we could do that. So there was a lot of negotiation, and you had to really think through what the impact of becoming an early years center was going to be. Yeah, there have to. I'm not familiar with Quebec. And some of the boards are pretty small, and some of them are, again, depending on the size of the organization. Like the one that I'm with, we are up to about a $4 million budget, so we've got a pretty strong board. If you're operating one of those rural early years centers where you're providing a service to 10 children, then the structure of your board is going to be pretty different.
Question here.
Yes. So we do have family resource centers, and that is absolutely a critical part of what's provided. Again, it varies from community to community, but certainly within Charlottetown, one of the things we've got, you know, family resource centers, but we also have welcome centers where people can drop in, and this has been a real benefit to the immigrant community. So people can drop in for a few hours, again, modeled on the First Duty experience, where people can drop in for a few hours. There's trained early childhood educators there who can work with parents to help them. But the family resource centers are an absolutely critical part of it. Absolutely critical, yeah.
Okay. This is going to be our last question for now. Yes.
Is there a change in the ratios of staff to children with problems that can with funding for the operation?
Oh, I don't think there was. Yeah, I don't think the ratios changed. I'm looking to Jane here because, yeah, she's more into the details, but I don't think there was a change in the ratios. But the level of certification that was required really changed. So now anybody to be involved in an early childhood, early years center has to have a minimum certification level, where before people could kind of come in off the street and be trained on the job. So the certification levels really changed, but the ratios didn't.
So did they also not have one person at the lead that had to have the training and as an assistant after that very long? And there was a scale that